I was just planting marigolds. And then a voice I hadn't heard in 20 years said, "They're going to look beautiful when they bloom." And just like that, something in me woke up. The woman among marigolds, my name is Linda, and I live on the edge of a quiet town nestled near the Blue Ridge Mountains. Life here moves slowly, gently, like the way light filters through lace curtains in the early morning. Since turning 60, my days have become quieter, more spacious. I used to think that stillness meant emptiness, but I've come to understand it's something else entirely. A kind of fullness that doesn't need noise. After decades spent teaching in noisy classrooms and raising two boys who now have children of their own, I've found sanctuary in my garden. It's not fancy, no fountains or manicured hedges, just rows of herbs, wildflowers, and vegetables growing in their own imperfect rhythm. It's where I go when the world feels too loud, where I can kneel in the dirt and remember who I am. That morning, the sky was already bright. The sun cast golden patches between the maple trees, and bees hummed lazily among the lavender. The smell of earth, warm and damp, clung to the air. I was planting a new row of marigolds near the back border, wearing my old straw hat and gloves worn thin at the fingertips. I was humming softly, completely caught up in the rhythm of digging and pressing the soil. So when a voice spoke behind me, it startled me, not because it was loud, but because it was familiar. "They're going to look beautiful when they bloom." I turned quickly, heart fluttering in that strange way it does when the past quietly taps you on the shoulder. Standing just a few feet away was Tom. He looked different, of course, older, broader, sun-kissed from outdoor work. But there was something unmistakably familiar in his posture, in the way he held his smile. Years ago, he had been the neighborhood paperboy, the one with the red bike and the shy wave. Now he was in his early 30s, carrying himself with the quiet confidence of someone who has worked with his hands and learned to appreciate silence. "Tom? My goodness, I haven't seen you in ages." He smiled, and for a moment the years melted. "I was visiting my mom. Thought I'd take a walk. Didn't expect to see you out here, still tending this garden." I laughed, brushing dirt from my knees as I stood. Some things don't change. We stood there for a few seconds, taking each other in. Not romantically, not yet, but with the quiet recognition that happens when two people remember each other from a time when life was simpler. He offered to help with the planting, and I didn't say no. He picked up a small trowel from the gardening bag and knelt beside me. For a while we worked in silence. The kind that isn't awkward but easy, like a song you've known forever. We talked just enough. He told me about his work designing outdoor spaces. I spoke of my grandchildren and the joy I find in watching things grow, even now. At one point, our hands brushed as he passed me a marigold. It was brief, innocent, but it lingered. A small moment, like the way a single petal catches the wind before it falls. When I looked up, his eyes were already on mine. Not intense, but open, curious, present. And for the first time in a very long while, I didn't feel like just a woman planting flowers. I felt like someone being seen. Maybe it meant nothing. Maybe it was just a nice visit. But as he waved goodbye and walked down the path, the sunlight catching his shoulders, I felt a gentle stirring inside, like the soft beginning of something I hadn't expected, but maybe quietly had been waiting for. Lavender and lemonade. Tom returned a few days later, just as the afternoon light was beginning to tilt golden across the yard. This time he carried a tray of heirloom tomato seedlings, their leaves still damp from watering. I heard the garden gate creak open, and even before I saw him, I felt a small involuntary flutter in my chest, like the hush before music begins. "I thought these might have a home here." he said with a quiet grin, holding the tray like an offering. We knelt in the soil together, once again falling into that same rhythm: dig, plant, pat down. He spoke about his work, a new garden he was designing for a nearby library. I listened, interested not just in the project but in the way his eyes lit up when he spoke about soil types and the angle of the sun. In turn, I shared little things: how my youngest grandson had recently learned to whistle, how the lavender had bloomed 2 weeks early this year. The conversation wasn't deep, but it was real. There was a kind of honesty in its simplicity. After planting, I poured 2 glasses of lemonade and led him to the bench beneath the old oak tree. We sat without speaking for a while, the quiet folding around us like a shawl. The air was thick with the scent of lavender and warm stone. For once, I didn't feel the need to fill the silence. He glanced at me, his tone softer now. You know, when I was younger, I always thought you were the calmest person in the neighborhood. You made everything feel less heavy. I laughed, surprised. Grace feels like something I left behind a long time ago. He turned to face me, his expression sincere. No, it's still there. Maybe more now. His words settled into me, gently but deeply. I looked down at my hands that had wiped tears, planted gardens, bandaged scraped knees, and stirred countless pots of soup. Maybe grace wasn't about smooth skin or youth. Maybe it was something else: endurance, gentleness, presence. We sat there until the sun began to dip, casting the whole yard in a soft golden hue. As he stood to leave, he didn't say much. Just a small wave and, "See you soon, Linda." After he left, I stayed on the bench a while longer, fingers wrapped around a now warm glass of lemonade. The marigolds swayed gently in the breeze. And somewhere inside something stirred, a quiet knowing that something tender was beginning to take root. It was late Friday afternoon when I heard the sound, the slow, familiar creak of the garden gate. I had just come inside to rinse my hands after trimming the rose bushes, still wearing my gardening gloves and the same worn shirt I always reached for. I stepped onto the porch, towel in hand, and there he was. Tom stood at the edge of the path, holding a small box in both hands. His navy shirt clung slightly from the heat, and a few strands of hair curled at his forehead. He looked casual, unhurried, like he belonged in that moment. "Hope I'm not too late," he said, lifting the box with a shy smile. "I brought something." Inside were 2 small ceramic planters, hand-painted with tiny green vines that curled around their edges. One had a small chip near the base, but it only made them feel more personal, more real. "I made them," he said. "Thought your lavender might like a prettier home." My fingers traced the glaze slowly. No one had made something for me in a very long time. "They're beautiful, Tom. Truly." We planted the lavender in silence this time. Not because we had run out of things to say, but because the quiet between us had started to feel comfortable, earned. The kind of silence that only grows between people who no longer feel the need to fill every space with words. When we finished, I brushed the soil from my palms and, without really thinking, said, "Would you like to come in for some tea?" He hesitated only briefly, then nodded. "I'd like that." The house was cooler than outside. The late sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, painting the table in warm gold. I poured 2 glasses of iced tea and set them on the wooden table, its surface worn from years of family dinners and quiet breakfasts alone. Tom's gaze drifted to the mantel, where an old photograph sat, my husband and I, dancing in the backyard under string lights, our eyes mid-laughter. "Do you miss him?" he asked gently. I didn't look away. "Every day, but differently now. He's not a wound anymore. He's part of who I am." Tom nodded slowly, respectfully. I think he'd be proud of you, of the life you've made. That struck something inside me. Not sadness exactly. Something deeper. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. Instinctively, not planned. His thumb brushed lightly across the back of mine. Slow. Thoughtful. I don't want to make you uncomfortable, he said softly. You're not, I replied, and I meant it. He stood, then walked around the table and reached for me. Gently, patiently, as if giving me space to step forward or away. I didn't move back. I looked up at him. This man so much younger, yet somehow more grounded than anyone I'd known in years. When he leaned in, he paused just long enough for me to breathe, and then his lips met mine. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, intentional, real. When we pulled apart, there were no explanations, no awkward apologies. He rested his forehead against mine, and we stood there in stillness. That night, we didn't cross any boundaries that couldn't be uncrossed. He stayed for a while longer. We laughed, talked, even danced clumsily in the kitchen when a slow song played on the radio. It was sweet, slightly awkward, beautiful. When he left, he kissed my cheek gently and said, "I'll see you soon." And when the door closed behind him, the house didn't feel as quiet as it had the week before. It felt like something had shifted, like something was beginning. And I, who had once believed that the season for surprise had long passed, was suddenly not so sure anymore. The days that followed seemed to stretch and soften. I moved through my routines with a kind of quiet attentiveness, folding laundry slower, listening to the birds with more curiosity, lingering longer in the mirror. I told myself not to expect anything, and yet I caught myself glancing down the road every so often, listening for footsteps that didn't yet come. It was a warm Sunday afternoon when the knock finally arrived, not on the door, but at the garden gate. I looked up from my rose bushes just as Tom entered, carrying a woven basket filled with groceries. "Thought I'd return the favor," he said with a smile. "You fed me tea and kindness. I figured it's my turn." He wasn't in work clothes this time, just a simple button-down shirt, sleeves rolled casually, jeans, and a calm I was beginning to associate with him. We cooked together in the kitchen. I chopped vegetables while he stirred a sauce that filled the air with garlic and something slightly sweet. Music played softly from the radio, an old jazz standard I hadn't heard in years. Our movements became a kind of unspoken dance. At one point, our hands brushed over the same spoon, and we both smiled, neither of us needing to comment. Over dinner on the back porch, we sat surrounded by the garden in full bloom. The marigolds were open now, bright and steady. The tomatoes he had brought were growing tall, reaching for the last of the sunlight. Tom leaned back in his chair, eyes scanning the horizon. "I didn't expect this," he said, his voice quiet. "Us. Whatever this is." "Neither did I admitted. "But I'm glad it's happening." He turned to look at me, and this time there was no hesitancy in his expression. "I know there's an age difference. I know how it might look to other people. But none of that has changed how I feel when I'm with you. You make me feel steady. Honest. Seen." That word again, seen. I felt it land deeper than before. I looked out toward the garden, the rows and vines, the little life we had cultivated together without quite realizing it. "I spent years thinking that part of my life was over," I said softly. "Love, attraction, even just being noticed. I buried it under routines and safe choices. But then you walked into my garden, and everything shifted." He reached across the table, his hand finding mine. There was no urgency in his touch. Just warmth, willingness, presence. "I don't know where this leads," he said, "but I'd like to keep walking with you. Wherever it goes." I didn't rush to answer. I let his words hang in the air. And then slowly I smiled, the kind of smile that comes not from hope or longing, but from something more rooted. Something real. I'd like that too. The sky dimmed to a dusky lavender, and the first stars appeared overhead. We stayed outside, hands entwined on the tabletop, as the fireflies began to rise, silent sparks drifting up from the soil we had both touched. No declarations. No promises, just two people sitting together in the soft unfolding of something new. There's something sacred about the silence that grows between people who no longer feel the need to explain themselves. With Tom, the silences had begun to feel less like pauses and more like invitations, space to breathe, to simply exist. He came by more often now, sometimes with a small basket of herbs or a cutting from a plant he thought I might like. Other times with nothing but himself and an easy smile. Each visit felt effortless, never expected yet always welcome. One afternoon we sat beneath the shade of the oak tree, glasses of water sweating in the heat, the garden buzzing with the soft hum of summer. I had been talking about something trivial, how the squirrels had begun stealing the ripe figs, when I noticed the way he was looking at me, not in a way that made me feel on display, but in a way that made me feel understood, as if he were listening not just to my words but to the spaces between them. "I love the way you tell stories," he said. "Even about figs." I smiled. "I think I forgot how to be interesting." He shook his head gently. "You didn't forget. You were just too busy taking care of everyone else." His words settled over me like warm linen, simple, soft, and somehow just right. I had spent so many years being necessary. I hadn't realized how much I missed simply being seen for who I was, rather than for what I gave. And Tom, in all his quiet gentleness, had never asked me to prove anything. That evening, I stood by the mirror in my bedroom brushing my hair. The silver strands glinted in the soft light, and for the first time in years, I didn't wish them away. There was something beautiful in their honesty. Tom made no declarations. He brought no promises wrapped in ribbon, but he brought presence. He brought kindness. He brought a mirror I hadn't dared look into for far too long, and in that mirror, I no longer saw a woman who had been left behind by life. I saw someone still unfolding, still worth listening to, still full of grace. The next time Tom came by, there were no plants, no tools, no baskets in his hands, just him. I was sitting on the back steps with a book resting in my lap, though I hadn't turned a page in 10 minutes. When he walked into the garden, I looked up and smiled without thinking. "Hi," he said simply. "Hi," I echoed just as simply. We didn't do anything special that afternoon. We didn't even talk much. We sat under the oak tree again, the one that had become our quiet sanctuary. I told him about a dream I'd had. A strange one where the marigolds grew tall enough to cover the house. He laughed and I laughed with him, realizing how rare it was to laugh like that. Light, unencumbered. Eventually we went inside. The house felt warm, full, not with heat, but with something that hummed quietly beneath the surface. I poured 2 glasses of iced tea, and we stood at the kitchen window watching the garden bathed in golden light. "Do you ever wonder how long something like this can last?" I asked, not looking at him. "What do you mean?" "This peace." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think peace doesn't always need to last. Sometimes it just needs to be felt. Fully." Even if it's just for now. I turned to him and he was already looking at me. He stepped closer, and this time when he kissed me, there was no hesitation, no breath held. It wasn't like the first time, tentative and cautious. It was slow, grounded, soft. The kind of kiss that doesn't ask for anything except presence. When we pulled apart, he didn't move away. His hand stayed lightly on my waist, and I rested my forehead against his chest, listening to the steady beat of a heart that had come to feel oddly familiar. We didn't speak much after that. We sat on the floor in the living room while a jazz record played, letting the music fill the spaces we didn't need to fill ourselves. He hummed along to a melody I didn't recognize, and I felt something bloom in my chest that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with being at ease. Later we danced. Slowly, bare feet on the wooden floor, my cheek against his shoulder, the world outside falling away. There were no grand gestures, no candles, no script. Just music. Just breath. Just us. And in that moment, I realized that intimacy didn't have to be loud to be real. Sometimes it speaks the clearest in silence. The days that followed carried a softness I hadn't known in years. Nothing dramatic happened. There were no proclamations, no sudden decisions, no lines crossed or milestones reached. Just a gentle unfolding. Tom came by when he could, sometimes with a story from his work, other times with a carton of berries or a new herb for the garden. Sometimes he brought nothing but his company, which somehow always felt like enough. We planted. We sat. We made quiet meals and laughed at small things. And every once in a while, our hands would meet in the middle of a shared task and stay there a moment longer than necessary. There was something deeply reassuring in the ordinary rhythm of it all. One evening I found myself baking, something I hadn't done in months. As the scent of cinnamon and clove filled the kitchen, I caught sight of my reflection in the window. Hair pulled back loosely, apron slightly dusted in flour, a quiet smile I hadn't seen on my face in years. I looked alive. That night, Tom arrived just as the sun dipped low, turning the garden gold. He didn't knock. He didn't need to. He walked through the gate like he belonged there, and maybe he did. We sat on the porch with tea and warm slices of spice cake, the garden around us glowing in twilight. Fireflies began to blink into life, rising like sparks from the ground. "I don't know what to call this," I said, voice barely above the hum of the night. "You don't have to call it anything," he replied gently. "It just is." We sat in silence for a while, watching the fireflies float and flicker. I leaned into him and he rested his hand on mine. Not to hold, not to claim, just to be there. And for the first time in many, many years, I didn't feel like a woman standing at the edge of something fading. I felt like I was at the beginning of something quietly blooming, not a new chapter, a new season. And maybe, just maybe, this one would be the most beautiful of all.